Hey, this is Nick from Kinetic, and thanks for checking out our series from the floor. Like I always say, one of our goals at Kinetic is just general industry knowledge. So we're putting together this series to just highlight different brokers, talk about some best practices and general brokering advice. Today, I got Alex from Merge Freight on here. Alex, thanks for being on, man. Do you want to do a quick intro?
Yeah, I'm Alex Maurer. I'm with Merge Freight. I've been in the brokerage industry for about 11 years, and we've been with Merge Freight for about 6 months. We're based in Atlanta, and excited to be here with Nick.
Cool, man. You're my first repeat guest, so congratulations,
Wow.
I guess. I
Big
know.
things happening.
Exactly.
Do I get an award?
I mean, you should figure that out later. So today we're talking about carrier network retention, and I don't know if that's a universal term or not. Personally, I talk a lot about carrier reuse. So I guess let's start by getting everybody on the same page and asking, what do you mean by carrier network retention?
I expect that term to be on the award you present me.
I'll do my best.
The way we look at carrier network retention and the way we define it is just the number of times defined by your company that you reuse a carrier in a rolling, like a selected rolling period of time. So number of times in a selected rolling period of days. And that really is just it. It's very simple.
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of brokerages track that statistic, even though the terminology might be a little bit different. So let me ask the follow-up question of why is that important?
There's a couple of reasons. Just kind of taking it down to two. You're going to you're going to be able to deliver a higher level of service when you're just reusing carriers, especially if you're reusing them on the same lanes. Your same carriers are going to align with you on your service expectations, and through your customers, through you, you're able to give those expectations to your carrier. And if you're reusing the same carrier each time, those expectations from your customer are going to translate to your carrier. Another reason, and this is one I feel passionate about, but really, you're giving your drivers and your carriers a better work environment if you're reusing them on the same freight. If they know what they're doing each day, and we know that a lot of carriers live in a day-to-day environment. If you're giving them opportunity to work on the same freight or in the same region of the country each day, they're going to have a better quality of work and frankly, a better quality of life. And so those two things I think are really why they're important. We could dive down into a lot of other reasons, but for us at Merge, that's why.
No, I like those. And I mean, building the relationships are important. And to your first one, something I talked about a lot recently is knowing your cost to serve and doing things to actually drive that down, or at least not drive it up. And the fact that these regular carriers know your shippers, know your consignees, know your expectations, it helps that cost to serve thing too, because it's not some one-off carrier who doesn't know your shippers, doesn't know your invoicing process that you have to set up. So having that consistency in my mind is super important when talking about carrier retention. How do you go about improving on that statistic?
I'm going to say a really simple one first. Someone within your company that's owning those relationships is the first step and probably one of the most important. And I say someone owning carrier relationships, or maybe even a team of people owning carrier relationships. That's how you push the improvement. And then, going all the way back, starting to monitor it, that's important too. And those seem simple, but those are really important things. If you're not monitoring it, if you don't have somebody monitoring and taking care of carrier relationships, you need to start doing it. That's where you start. And then improvement comes from monitoring them month over month, week over week, all the way down to day over day, right? Why didn't we have this carrier on this load? Okay, well, they had a breakdown. Makes sense, right? If you can get that granular, you're going to have success with your carrier partners. And then the other obvious one, I think we're going to talk about this later, is technology. But I'll save that for the next question. So
okay, you mentioned about people or groups of people owning that carrier relationship, and I hear people talk about that a lot. But I guess what do you mean when you talk about owning that relationship? What does that what does that entail for you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you think about a customer relationship, and actually last time I was on here, I think we talked about customers. Your carriers are your customers. So everything from making sure that they get paid on time, all the way to understanding, you know, meeting them where they're at on their schedules. One person needs to understand the ins and outs of that carrier relationship, or that carrier's process, their day to day, where their truck's landing, getting on the phone with them, having conversation about where there's opportunity to make their network, their drivers more efficient. It's going to go a long way with those carriers. So it starts with a conversation from your representatives, but the questions are the most important thing. Just like with your customers, the questions are the most important thing because you want to be a professional with them. You want to understand what they're doing each day. Carrier questions are just as important. I gave it a good example of one where your truck's landing every day. Where is there inefficiency in your network? But there's 100 more, right? But yeah, training your representatives to ask the right questions to your carriers to make them more successful, going to go a long way with your carrier network.
Yeah, I've always appreciated when people kind of phrase it in terms of carrier ownership, because it encompasses all that goes into the relationship, because otherwise there's a tendency to kind of treat those carrier relationships as more transactional. Just, oh, I booked a load. Cool. Great. Yeah. Let's stop talking to these people now.
I've actually, you know, I think you nailed it with that one. Ownership. That's an important one. And you just brought up another really good point. The brokerage environment can, I mean, just you've been a broker before. And you talk to a lot of them, but you know, as well as anybody, the brokerage environment can drive that. I booked that load. It had to go, success, right? But like, what's the next step with that carrier? And your management team of the carrier teams need to be thinking about those next steps and training the people on those next steps. So not letting that carrier get away from you. They booked a hot load. You might've paid them a little bit over market to book that hot load, but like, why were they available? And like, make sure that you put them on your next available load in that market.
Yeah, no, people definitely undervalue that. Not even undervalue that. You know, I think people understand the value, but it gets lost in the day-to-day a lot of times. So you have to kind of take a more proactive approach to actually doing those things. So in terms of, like, we recognize this is important. How do you get individual employees on board with it? Because like that ties into what we were talking about. Like they get lost in the shuffle of, oh, I got to get this load booked. Oh, I got to do this. I got to do that. How do you drive more carrier retention with individual employees?
I'm going to hit on 3 points here. And the first one I think is the most important. And I'd end with this one too, if I could, but it's really a culture. And I've been at places where there's, you know, not that culture, and it needs to be, and then where it ended up being taught and so forth. But treating your carriers and making sure you're getting everybody on, like, understanding how hard it is to be a truckload carrier and how expensive it is, and how each day can be a struggle figuring out how to find your next, like, pay for your next, like, you know, tank of fuel. Like, it's a culture. Respect to your carriers, making your people understand, helping them understand that your carriers are your customers too. That's where it all starts. I think that leads in a little bit to helping your people understand that our business only succeeds with strong carrier relationships. The end there. And you know, finally, and this goes back to my first point, but getting everybody on the level of how hard the work is to be a carrier, helping each carrier representative understand that every load you give a carrier, every time you're able to connect them through the United States through that famous triangle, right? In a carrier network, it is making their lives easier and keeping them rolling and making sure that they get that next tank of fuel. So those would be my 3, but again, I'm going to finish it off. It's about driving a respectful culture in your workplace to understand that carriers are customers, and they are what make us succeed, and they're the only reason we're able to succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously completely agree with that. And I was talking to Tyler Montgomery from Steam the other week, and like he similarly said something about having empathy for people within the supply chain that like really struck a chord with me. And it's just like you're saying, like you have to understand what those drivers are going through every day, and like really get individual folks within your company to understand that too. I think you guys both did a great job of describing that. Kind of moving on to the next thing that like we were approaching earlier, but like what kind of technology can you use to help with carrier retention?
Hitting on two, and these, they're widely available right now. I think there's, I mean, off the top of our head, we could probably name three maybe that are doing it in the market,
Yeah.
but capacity management, or a CRM. And I think those, I don't know if I can name one that's doing both. Now I'm probably going to get, well, maybe we'll get some sales calls after this one, but
drive business for somebody.
That's right. Capacity management and CRM, for your carriers, they're just as important as your customer CRM. So reutilizing that network. Some of them have some brilliant AI on the back end that really help you like track your network and present like carriers for loads that you're putting on the board and immediately booking them. So that stuff's really cool. It's out there. And if you have somebody doing that in an Excel sheet right now, it's time to move on from that, because that person could be calling new carriers to bring into your network. The second piece of tech is capacity injection. Some of the famous ones doing this right now, I mean, yeah, the most famous one is putting it out on a load board. That brings carriers into your network, but that's not like what people want to be doing. So there are other interesting ways through ELDs that you can bring carriers into your network, but there's a lot of tech that focus on those two things, and that's capacity management and capacity injection, and that drives carrier reuse.
Okay, I've never heard it described as capacity injection before. That's an interesting one.
I'll let you have that. You can have that one.
You're gonna let me have it? Okay, cool. This is what I get for having people on the show twice now. They let me use their phrases. So how do you get individual employees on board with the technology? Because that's a separate piece to it, at least in my mind, because they get accustomed to doing things the way they've been doing things. How do you get them to start incorporating technology instead of their Excel spreadsheet or whatever they might be using?
That's a great question.
If anything.
Oh man, that's a great question. And I lots of thoughts there. I'll try to hit a couple. I've said this before when talking with some people about this technology in general, but the easiest way to put it is that some of this technology, it's not as simple as like plugging an iPhone in and like using it, right? It doesn't just work day one. There's all sorts of different TMS systems that require all sorts of training. The most important thing is to have a champion within your company that is going to learn the technology, because it does work. Frankly, it does work as long as you put it into your network and get the carriers on board and get your carrier team on board. So the answer is getting a champion within your company that will take that technology, teach their peers, and teach their carriers to use it. That's really number one.
If there are any freight tech companies watching this, there may or may not be. They should listen to that the champion thing. I completely agree about that. That's really helpful for adoption of technology. Yep. So what are some common mistakes, right? Like in terms of carrier retention, what are some things that you see routinely done wrong?
Yeah, I mean, just not having that as a metric. I know that sounds really simple, but the most common mistake is I would say is not focusing on it, because you and I know that a lot of people don't, and it is important to focus on and make sure that you are reutilizing your carriers. Or this is something I've seen you talk about before, but there's plenty of people out there right now that are booking a new carrier on a load that they've had before when they could have just called the carrier they had on it before. Right. So those are the mistakes you see. And I think everybody's guilty of them. We're working on that as an industry.
Yeah, no, that's good. So we're running low on time. So like the way we wrap these things up is typically by asking like, what's something that you've learned recently? These are all about education. Everyone's always learning. So for you, what's something that jumps out?
We're always, you nailed it, always learning. Some advice. I think that we need to meet carriers where they're at on payment, like where they're at on payment. Just that's it. I mean, like, because there are interesting pieces of tech in on the payment side of freight. But going back to our earlier bit about like, how do you get people more involved? It's understanding that's like filling up a truck right now is not cheap. And, you know, fixing a truck when you have to fill it up tomorrow is also like, could put a carrier out of business. So if they're not getting their, you know, their next check, right, that they've expected from you, and you're not making that easy for them, then we're not meeting the carriers where they're at. And we need to do a better job of that. So my advice is making sure that our industry focus, like we need to focus on meeting our carriers where they're at on the payment side of things. And I'm learning a lot about that, you know, as a business owner. It's interesting for sure.
No, that's great advice. And I mean, we talked about a lot of things. You might end up being the first 3-time guest on the show, because we talked about a lot of stuff today that I think could be incorporated into a whole different episode of these. But we're intentionally trying to keep them short. That way they're quick and digestible, but the industry is really nuanced. They're complicated subjects. There's always more to learn. Alex, if somebody wants to reach out to you, how do they do it?
My email, Maurer at merge-freight.com. LinkedIn's always great. And my cell phone is on my LinkedIn. So anywhere.
All right, perfect.
All right,
perfect, Alex. So thanks for being on. I'm really looking forward to seeing more from you and the group at Merge Freight.
Thank you.